Masturbation. Love it or leave it. So, this video addresses a sensitive topic, and I will be as frank as possible about this topic that is extremely personal. I'm pretty sure that you, dear viewer, will disagree with me on some points and perhaps condemn me on others. However, I'm happy for you to prove me wrong on this subject. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. If you like that I'm addressing this topic, please like the video and consider hitting the subscribe button. I love you. So I'm going to attempt to address whether or not masturbation is good for you first. I'm a medical doctor. I specialize in psychiatry. And so I will address some of the information that we know about the physical, psychological, and relational consequences of engaging or abstaining from masturbation, including the impact of pornography and fantasy. I will also share from my personal experience and perspective, as well as looking at passages from Jewish and Christian scriptures that may be relevant. At the end of the video, I'll make some suggestions for what I consider best practices for those considering masturbation or solo sex as a healthy option for them. So here we go. Is masturbation a good thing? Yes and no. Many people are prone to all or nothing thinking, and I know some of you have already made your mind up about masturbation. For you, it's either always a green light or always a fail. And if you're certain you're right and don't want to reconsider, you are welcome to stop watching now. Just beat it. Just kidding. I hope you stay with me. So masturbation is a standard term for what we use for self-stimulation of the body, particularly the genitals for sexual pleasure. So if you're like me, the word itself seems somehow wrong and dirty. Maybe because its origins are likely from words that indicate something improper or nasty. And so the word sounds to me a little like something gross you would put on a fish hook, like nasty bait. Who would want that, and who would admit to doing it, right? So for this reason, I tend to refer to self-stimulation or sexual self-stimulation or simply solo sex. Obviously, it misses the mark when we think of the highest use of our private body parts, which is obviously to connect us with another person in a deep and pleasurable way. So without another person present, it will always fail to be as glorious and satisfying as sex is designed by God to be. So right off the bat, I'm going to say masturbation is not your best bet for your sexuality. Nevertheless, from a physiological point of view, psychological point of view, there's compelling evidence that it does provide from some tangible benefits. For instance, studies have shown that this activity can reduce stress, it can relieve tension, improve your sleep, it can increase your focus, boost your mood, alleviate aches and pains, and enhance your sex life. Not only that, but it can help prevent anxiety and depression, and you get some good exercise in there as well. In addition to all these things, there's no risk of pregnancy, and you can get a sexually transmitted infection through solo sex. Yay! There may also be a benefit for men in keeping our prostate healthy. When it comes to orgasms, it seems that too many or too few may both be problematic for the prostate and for healthy development emotionally and relationally. Men who have very few orgasms or lots of orgasms tend to be more prone to benign prostatic hyperplasia or BPH, which can lead to problems with urination and other things. So from a medical point of view, I don't have any qualms saying that you can engage in masturbation without growing hair on your palms or going blind, which are two things that were once purported to be a consequence of the heinous handiwork of masturbation. Um, but it also may be good for you in the ways just mentioned. So, masturbation clearly feels good, but do you feel good or can you feel good about doing it? I'm a believer in God, and I'm convinced that there are some things that are clearly helpful in my life with God, and some things that are not. Some actions honor God, and others do not. Actions that miss the mark of His desire and design are therefore sin. So the Greek word for sin is hamartia, which means to miss the mark. It doesn't hit the bullseye of the target. Um, so some of you who believe in God are probably already asking, okay, or thinking, okay, well, it won't physically hurt me, but will it have a negative effect on me spiritually? The big question being, is masturbation sin? Well, the Apostle Paul says in Romans 14:23 that anything that does not proceed from faith is sin. So if you believe, for whatever reason, that masturbation is repugnant to God, you surely should not do it. This is what Paul the Apostle said about eating meat that was sacrificed to idols in First Corinthians. Writing to the Corinthian church, he said that if you believed it was sin, you should not do it. But because there were plenty of believers who saw eating meat sacrificed to idols as a participation in idolatry, or at least as profiting from or supporting evil. So for them, it was definitely taboo. But Paul did not give much account to idols, and he saw it as a matter of conscience. He urged his fellow believers to come to their own conclusion and by all means resist the urge to influence a neighbor to do anything that would leave them feeling guilty. So, my dear viewer, the last thing I want to do today is to urge you to violate your conscience when it comes to self stimulation or masturbation. For me personally, in my early years, seeing masturbation as taboo led to great problems for me. I had a huge amount of shame about masturbation, but I had a lot of shame about my body in general. I was a small kid. I was terrible at sports, um, and I was uncomfortable in my own skin. I wanted to be a girl. There was just a lot of reason for me to feel shame about my body and sexuality. And the issue of masturbation was just too big for me to handle, so to speak. So the number one reason I think that we avoid masturbation as believers and fail to enjoy it is shame. A large part of the shame for me resulted from the avoidance in my family of anything to do with sexuality. And it's obvious anything that is left in darkness can't be seen clearly. So I was in the dark. We need to talk about things to have clarity. Anything that we're afraid to share cuts us off from the possibility of true acceptance and can leave us feeling isolated and defective. If there's something about me that I am afraid to reveal, it means that I cannot feel truly connected with those around me because I'm hiding out. I'm withholding something. And I certainly was not going to talk to my parents about sexuality. I think for many people, the issue of masturbation is kind of cloudy because it is so personal. It's so private, so sacred and mysterious and uncomfortable that we avoid talking about it. And this gives the unspoken message that if even talking about it is bad, then it surely must be bad to admit that we do it. So the second reason that I think we may see orgasm as being wrong or bad is because when we masturbate and have a burst of oxytocin with orgasm, the bonding hormone orgasm, along with dopamine, which is the reward neurotransmitter, if we're alone when we have that burst of oxytocin, it's going to inevitably lead to a sense of letdown or disappointment, a sense of incompletion if we have that climax alone, because it that bonding hormone is intended to make us feel connected, and so when there's no one there, it can leave us feeling very much alone. And if you're like me, when I was younger and you don't believe that God wants to be present with us when we are engaged in this pleasurable activity, then we cut ourselves off from Him in order to participate in the activity, again, leading to a sense of alienation and regret in the aftermath of sexual release, because we've cut ourselves off from our sense of connection with God. So add to all that my belief that the enemy of our soul, Satan, wants to twist or bend everything good and wholesome and make them seem undesirable or wrong. If this tactic applies to masturbation, Satan has done an excellent job. In fact, in my experience, he always tempts us to do something pleasurable and then shame us in the aftermath. He's good at what he does. Of course, I also kind of blame Adam and Eve. Their eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil made them think about everything in legal rather than loving terms. Before that terrible decision to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, I suspect neither of them thought about exploring their own or the other's body in anything but curious and playful way. Naturally, they would avoid anything uncomfortable or painful or degrading, but if Eve woke up in the morning to Adam tugging on his erect penis, I suspect she might have said, well, looks like fun. Can I play too? They just didn't have the negative view of their bodies or sexuality that we tend to internalize in our growing up. Now, I'm convinced that the gospel, that the good news of Jesus coming, is intended to bring us back to that garden mentality, from legal to loving. And in 1 Corinthians 6, which I think is one of the greatest passages about sexuality, the Apostle Paul opens up with these words. He says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both, one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. That's verses 12 and 13. So Paul it looks like to me, is taking the view that we should not think about sexuality in legal terms. He says all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. Now, I think there's a very important reason for this, because we are meant to be free. We're made in the image of God. And anytime we feel restricted or constricted or constrained from outside, and the law is ultimately an external limit for us, we as human beings will tend to want to bust through that. And so when you make masturbation a bad thing, when you close that door and try to keep it closed by your effort, at a certain point, you will likely want to bust through the door or open the door to let the impulse in, and back again to that feeling of failure. So Paul again is saying, don't think about sexuality in legal terms. Don't think is it right or wrong. Instead, think it is helpful or harmful. Is the activity serving me, or have I begun serving it? He says, I won't be mastered by anything, including masturbation. So if masturbation or any other sexual activity for that matter, or eating, drinking, whatever, becomes driven, obsessive, or compulsive, If it takes away more of my time or attention that is warranted, or takes me away from better pursuits, it's a problem. Um, think of it a little bit like alcohol, which for many people can be safely used and add enjoyment to life, especially a festive occasion or a nice meal. But there are plenty of people who have crossed a line in their use of alcohol, and therefore it becomes something that takes away more than it adds to their life. And you may be one of those people that for you masturbation may take away more than it adds. And I have no problem with you saying, others may, I may not. But I think it is part of my desire in making this video to ask you, please not to stand in judgment on others who may see this issue differently, but do be firmly convinced in your own mind. So one of the cool things about sexual abstinence, even intermittently, like fasting from food, is that it can fuel our drive for other endeavors. There's a psychological term, it's called sublimation. And it's just that our sexual drive or urge or aggressive drives and impulses can fuel our achievement in art or athletics, academics, or promote serving others in spiritual pursuits. Our human desires for intimacy can actually be turned toward God, which is a beautiful thing. It's a powerful truth, and when it is honored, it brings great strength and comfort. My anchor verse when it comes to sexuality is from the opening lines of Psalm 63. It says, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you, as in a dry, weary land where there is no water." In this gorgeous passage, David declares his deepest desires, his strongest urges will not be satisfied by anything available on earth. Isn't that beautiful? His heart belonged to heaven. He longs to be reunited with the one who gave him life. Even though as king, David had access to all the delicacies and pleasures and sexual companions that he desired, the world was a dry, weary land when compared to his longing for God. As I said earlier, the Apostle Paul says the body is for the Lord and the Lord for the body. It's profound. Later in the chapter, Psalm 63, David relates to God on his bed, where many of us have struggled with loneliness and our longings for physical intimacy. Here's what he says: "My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you through the watches of the night." So focusing on God can lift our thoughts from unhealthy fantasy and keep us from lusting for that which is not ours. Thankfully, we belong to God. And David understood this. As a man after God's own heart, he turned his longings, the longings of his soul, and even the deep longings of his body toward God. In that line, he says, "My flesh yearns for you." So powerful. So David looks forward to the day, of course, when we will live in God's presence with eternal pleasures at his right hand. We don't know what that's going to be like, but it is going to be glorious. The God who came up with sex, we can only guess that is a faint foreshadowing of what we will experience in union with him. Paul reflects this idea in 1 Corinthians 6, where we read before. He says, "The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body." That's verse 13. So this is actually astonishing pronouncement. And frankly, it's kind of terrifying that God would desire us in that intimate way. Of course, the imagery of marriage and adultery is throughout the Old Testament as well as the New. And we shouldn't forget that God clearly shows his ownership over sexuality by putting his mark through circumcision on the penis, the one body part that belongs as much to a wife as to her husband. It's their connection point, that means of achieving the one flesh partnership that God designed marriage to be. So when it comes to masturbation, it seems to me that God's word is largely silent, which can add to our lack of certainty. And of course, we certainly love certainty. And because we don't want to be wrong or judged about sexual matters, it's tempting to take an extreme position. Since masturbation can lead to lust, to fantasy, preoccupation, compulsivity, it's tempting to put a big fence around it and make it completely forbidden. This is kind of what happened with dancing in the church I grew up in. Dancing was taboo because it might lead to sex. Of course, I heard later that Baptists and Church of Christ don't believe in having sex standing up because it might lead to dancing. Just kidding. So the Greek word, as I said, for sin is hamartia. It's an archery term that means to miss the mark. And so since sexuality and orgasm reach their greatest, highest expression in marriage, solo sex is never going to hit the bullseye. But even the first man was allowed to experience solitude before a connection. God gave Adam time alone before bringing Eve, even though God said it was not good for him to be alone. Did God do something bad by placing him alone in the garden? Not at all. It was perfectly appropriate for a time, for a season, he was alone. In a similar fashion, I like to think that masturbation may be developmentally appropriate if it's done with faith and a sense of blessing. And in Proverbs 5, I believe that's what Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, was doing for his son. The chapter starts out with the father putting some boundaries around sexual expression. But then the dad says to his son, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. It's verses 15 through 17. So our private parts are to be just that, private, for us alone, unless or until God gives us a mate. So the dad goes on, Solomon goes on to pronounce a blessing on his son's sexuality. He says, may your fountain be blessed, in verse 18. And he reminds the son in verse 21 that his ways are in full view of the Lord. Now, I love that he says that because he reminds his son, like, you can't hide from God. Like, he's there. Whatever you do, he is with you. And I think if I had understood that better, then I would not have had so much shame about masturbation because I would not have imagined myself being able to hide from God when doing it. So when a person is single, navigating sexuality can be challenging, especially if you have a high sex drive. And since sex is designed for sharing, masturbation will never be all God desires for us. And it is easy for the solo practitioner to slip into fantasy or into pornography, which Jesus' statement about committing adultery in the heart, I think, applies to both lust, after woman, actually lust, fantasy, and pornography. The scary thing about pornography is that your mirror neurons in your brain, when you watch someone doing a deliberate action, you are actually going through the motions in your own mind. You're actually doing whatever you're watching being done, and that's why certain movies are, in my mind, not healthy to watch. Watching people do deliberate violent acts in a evil way or sexual acts, I think, can potentially engage our minds in an unhealthy way. So the other thing about masturbation to pornography is that it gives you a strong dopamine release and an intensity of orgasm that you can almost not maybe ever achieve with a live partner. And if you expose your brain to a diet of pornography along with self-gratification, your ability to perform and enjoy sex with a real person can be deeply undermined. You just cannot um, sex with a loving partner cannot provide the high level of stimulation that you can get with pornography. Now, of course, the first man to receive God's breath was Adam. And I have a hunch that Adam discovered his penis and its powerful pleasure way before Eve came on the scene. In my imagination, maybe in a time when he's hanging out with God, he has a spontaneous erection, which provokes a conversation, which Adam is gushing about, how great it is to have this, body part that can enlarge and give him great pleasure. Um, and I think that God probably, again, pronounced a blessing on his sexuality and encouraged him that a time would come when he could share the thing with another one like him. As I mentioned before, though, in my home as a kid, everything about sexuality was shrouded in mystery and foreboding. Um, and although I had the appropriate masculine appendage, like Adam, I never even heard the word penis. I'm not kidding. And I only learned about the vagina when I'm working on the weekends, maintaining the lawn in a doctor's office in Garland, Texas, when I was 8th or ninth grade. There was a little informational book about sex, which was all the guidance I had. And for a long time, since I never heard the words spoken, I thought sure that the word for the inner part of a woman's genitalia was pronounced vagina. So when I later learned how to bring myself to climax, it thrust me on a path of shame, self-castigation, regret, um, renewed resolve, and eventually repeated broken promises to myself and to God. And because I believed it was disgusting to God, I only did it when I felt disconnected from Him or let down my guard enough to engage in self-gratification through masturbation. Obviously, with my mentality, doing so meant withdrawing from God's presence in similar fashion to what Adam and Eve did when they became aware of their nakedness. So, if you remember the story, they hear God coming, and they hide from Him. So, obviously, God had seen them, many, many times naked. But when God asks why they're hiding, Adam's like, I was naked and I was afraid. Like, what? I think it's safe to say that God was not uncomfortable or offended by Adam and Eve's nakedness in the least, but I think they projected their own discomfort onto Him, which is exactly what I think I did in regard to enjoying any self-pleasure by sexual self-stimulation. So sadly, this discomfort with my sexuality caused a lot of damage to my enjoyment of my relationship with God and my own body, and it became really a unnecessary focus of my spiritual well-being and robbed me of a lot of peace and joy. There was a time as I got a little older, I really did feel convicted that God wished for me to fast from any sexual release for a period of 6 months. And for me, that was significant, that He used that time to reset my sexuality to some degree and to get the issues sidelined for a time. And it was into that 6 month that I felt really deeply connected to the goodness of my masculinity and felt convinced that marriage and my wife Terry were absolutely right for me. So if you're considering, or if you already are in a period of sexual abstinence, God can use that in very good and powerful ways. So after we married, with God's help, we had a really satisfying and playful and passionate sexual connection. But it was evident early on that my drive and Terry's drive were not completely matched, that mine was significantly higher than hers. And before long, I began supplementing our sexual encounters with masturbation on the side. Naturally, this provoked some internal conflict, and I felt bad about my dirty little secret. Once again, secrecy and shame marred my consciousness. It was actually years into our marriage that I finally got the courage up to ask my wife, Terry, what she thought about masturbation. Her response, I thought all guys did that. That was not what I was expecting. And like, so liberating, really, for me for her to respond in such a blasé, way. It really was cool because the conversation, which was, had terrified me. I was certain that she would have a negative view. But it turns out that I had projected my bad feelings about masturbation onto her. She didn't feel that way at all, and she actually preferred me taking care of my excess need while lying next to her in bed rather than in the shower or in solitude. Sometimes, of course, we would kiss or engage in other playful or passionate exchange, but sometimes she would just read her book while I took care of my own need. But even that made me feel deeply accepted and connected with her, largely because the shame was gone and I felt seen, I felt known, and I felt understood by her. It was really a great day. So eventually, I had some more conversations with God about it. And I became convinced that I had made assumptions about him just as I had about my wife. I began to realize that my shame had kept me from really communicating with God about it, and it interrupted my communion with him as it did with Adam and Eve because they felt ashamed. They withdrew from his presence. And of course, anytime I felt disconnected from God, that would put me on the prowl for pleasure or escapist activities, masturbation being one of them. Once I began to be more open with him, I found I was not met with this any disgust or disdain that I had imagined. On the contrary, for me, when I began to talk to him about my sexuality and about masturbation, I actually felt his blessing on that if it was done in connection and worship of him, that it could engage in a way that was grateful and thoughtful. I think it's of note that God constructed our bodies in a way that taking care of our own needs sexually is pretty handy, pretty easy to do. I will say that I heard once that there is one verse in the Bible that does refer to masturbation. It's in the book of Ecclesiastes. It says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might." I know it's crass, but once I took masturbation out of the illegal, taboo, or forbidden designation, it was no longer so compelling. Proverbs says, "Bread eaten in secret is sweet." And so when we designate masturbation as sin, it may actually lead or add to its attractiveness. So for me, at least, when I took it out of the closet and asked myself whether I wanted to masturbate, I found it had less appeal because I could think rationally about whether it would ultimately add to or take away from my day and my joy. I knew it would give me a few moments of intense pleasure, but might dampen my enjoyment of lesser delights in my day. So if we were to determine, and by no means am I proposing to be the authority on this, but if we were to determine there's no overt sin in masturbation, would that discredit or minimize the value of those who are or have been celibate completely for the sake of the kingdom? No. By no means. On the contrary, for me, abstinence for Jesus' sake is precious. It's like giving money to God. If I give a tithe because I believe it's the right or required thing, it has value, but giving cheerfully, generously, and gratefully is way better, both for me and for God. So if you're offended that I may be taking masturbation out of the evil category, um, it doesn't mean that it is not valuable to surrender it for God, for the sake of God. Just like fasting from food does not mean that food is bad, or being a teetotaler and avoiding alcohol does not necessarily mean that evil is because alcohol is evil, but it's an act of surrender and an act of love for God. So I think that when we are motivated by love, it's the highest value. And anything we give up for God, including masturbation, will be repaid many times over when we are with Him forever. So, a few words: if you are married, masturbation in secret misses the mark. My rule for married men is don't shoot unless the target is in sight. You need either mentally or physically, you want to be focused on your the mate that God has given you. In marriage, masturbation can be clearly wrong when it takes away from that urge to merge that fosters passion and pursuit and intimacy. Um, and I've worked with couples where one has chosen the easy path of just self pleasure and robbed their mate of that pursuit toward the sexual intimacy between husband and wife. Now, as I mentioned, in cases where one has a much higher need for sexual release, then I believe the two need to discuss how to manage the discrepancy. You don't want one to feel pressured or obligated. You don't want the other to feel deprived. It takes energy and time and conversation, but you can figure out how to manage that disparity if it exists. So for some couples, like I said, giving oneself pleasure while laying in the bed with the other could be a good option, with or without assistance. But each couple can decide what makes one partner feel cared for or satisfied without overburdening or disrespecting the other. But but masturbation in secret is going to produce shame. It's going to produce a sense of disconnection, and it interrupts that feeling of full acceptance and intimacy when you have full honesty and transparency. Obviously, if you're a man or woman who's been prone to sexual addiction, abstinence may be your best option, maybe your only true option, just as complete sobriety for many who are prone to abuse or overuse alcohol. My own father never drank alcohol because he saw the damage it did to family members. And if you're persuaded to abstain completely from masturbation or solo sex, I admire you. I affirm the goodness of your choice. So, for any of my viewers who have made it this far, I will offer a few thoughts about how to engage masturbation or self stimulation in the best way possible, provided that you believe that it is something you can do that honors God. So, number one, ask God to bless your sexuality. Having a strong libido or sex drive can be problematic, but it's a problem I don't want to be without. Ask for God's blessing on your sexuality. Number two, ask for clarity about how to engage your sexuality in a way that honors God, whether you are married or single. Again, anything that does not proceed from faith is sin. You want to be faithful. Number three, if possible, have a conversation about this topic with those that you trust enough to be honest and open with, and who you're willing to consider their opinions and feedback. Obviously, no one needs to tell you what to do, but they can offer perspectives that will help you. The scripture says, in abundance of counselors, there is wisdom. You'll hear something that resonates and hits home with you. And just talking with someone who is accepting and loving can help dispel whatever shame you may be holding on to. So rather than being at the mercy of your impulses, it's good to plan for it. This allows you, if you are going to masturbate, to enjoy the anticipation of it as well as the action, making sure that you have privacy and enough time to deeply enjoy the time you have to explore what feels good to your body at that time. Going without an orgasm for 7 days leads to a bump in testosterone if you're a man, so you may wish to have a time each week for cleaning out the pipes, if you will. So it's often helpful um, if you're masturbating or engaging in self-stimulation to use a lubricant. I've used massage oil, almond oil, vegetable oil, but hair conditioner is a great assist and almost always available. As a single man, before marriage, I would if I were masturbating, I would sometimes imagine being Adam in the garden and imagining how I felt when meeting and exploring Eve, and our sexuality together for the first time. For me, that felt like a safe way to imagine being in a relationship with a woman without actually fantasizing about someone that I knew. I would urge you to avoid fantasy and pornography, especially pornography. And I think maybe you may need to keep your eyes open so that you don't unconsciously drift into fantasy or lust, or replaying pornographic images. Um, Sometimes music or candlelight, incense, a hot shower, warm bath can set the mood. If you have time, you can repeatedly approach orgasm and back away. Certainly, you can enjoy self-stimulation without having an orgasm, and I think often that's a good strategy to employ, just like eating a good meal without overdoing it. Um, so as you become more and more connected to your body, your needs and sensations, um, you're going to find that you don't necessarily need to have an orgasm to enjoy just that being with yourself. It turns out that when we're engaged in sexual activity of any kind, we're actually more present. We're more in the moment than we ordinarily are. So just being in that meditative state can actually be a part of your exploration of your time alone with yourself and with God. If you're a believer in God, I think worship music is a nice way of maintaining your connection with Him and letting gratitude be a part of your deep and joyful experience of self-stimulation. David, who was described by God as a man after God's own heart, deeply appreciated his body. In Psalm 139, it's verse 14, he says, "I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." So I can imagine that one of the wonderful works that David was particularly thrilled with was the amazing hydraulics that moved his phallus from downward dog to full attention. It's my conviction that God wants us to enjoy when we engage our sexuality, and enjoy the privilege of leaving it alone if it takes away from our enjoyment of Him. I know this has been a long video, and I'm sure that I have said some things that are not helpful, maybe upsetting or distasteful, and I'm sorry. I have no doubt that I have missed the mark in some of these things. As Scripture seems to do in regard to the issue of masturbation, I leave it to you and to the dictates of your own conscience. And again, please forgive me if I've misspoken about any of this. I am interested in hearing your thoughts. If you would be so kind as to put your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if there are other topics that you would appreciate hearing me address. Again, this is a long video, but I'm sure there's much more that that could be said. I do want to I do want to end by reading a verse that of Paul's from 1 Corinthians. He says, "Do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It is not, it is good, sorry, it is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. The faith that you have, keep between yourself and God." So, that's Romans 14, by the way. I just pray that that in this discussion you will give me grace, that you be thoughtful about it. Talk to other people that you trust uh, and believe will guide you in a good way. And by all means, um, go to God. The scriptures by themselves will not lead you into all truth. Jesus said the scriptures are meant to lead you to me. And so, my dear brother or sister in Christ, please go to Jesus. Please ask him. And again, let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. I'm happy to be wrong. I love you.